Multiculturalism works, and for the most part it does work in Australia, when it's civic anchored. As I've said, one law for all, English in common life, but space for cultural difference. But I think it fails when it turns into rejectionism, if I put it in those terms. It fails if it denies that there's any shared Australian culture.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. One of the most critical questions facing our nation, immigration and social cohesion. How do we hold together when we may no longer share the same values? That's the question we'll be grappling with today. Over the past 70 years, Australia has transformed from a largely British society into one of the most culturally diverse nations on earth. And that transformation began with Robert Menzies, in earnest at least, whose post-war migration policies changed the face of our nation. He started, like most of his generation, with a belief in assimilation, the idea that new arrivals should become indistinguishable from native-born Australians. But over time, his thinking evolved. He came to see that integration, not uniformity, was the key to social cohesion, that people could preserve their cultural heritage while embracing the civic life of their new home. Under Menzies, over 3 million migrants were welcomed to Australia and integrated into society, while all the while maintaining social cohesion. It was a remarkable success story. It was built on conditions of full employment, rising home ownership, and a shared faith in our institutions of democracy. Australia became a model across the world of how a liberal society could combine diversity with unity and difference with belonging. But today, sadly, that delicate balance that we used to strike feels very fragile. In an age of rapid migration, identity politics, violent protests and online tribalism, it's no longer clear what the ties that bind us really are. Our guest today is Perter Kurti, Director of the Culture, Prosperity and Civil Society Program at the Centre for Independent Studies. And Perter has been reflecting on precisely this question in his new report, The Ties That Bind. And Perter is joining me from Sydney today to talk about how we can preserve that civic compact, what it really means to belong to a nation bound not by sameness but by shared citizenship. So firstly, welcome Perter Kurti to Afternoon Light Live.
Thank you, Georgina. Great to be with you. And thank you for inviting me to be a guest on the webinar.
Oh, no, it's a pleasure. And it's a great paper you have written, a timely paper, and I think a provocative paper as I read it. I think it's a really interesting contribution to our discussion around immigration, multiculturalism, and what it means to be an Australian. It seems through my lifetime of 46 years, I'll be open, that immigration sort of ebbs and flows is a major issue in our society. And it's clear at the moment that it is one of the big issues facing our country, and it's really troubling a lot of people in society. Why do you think this moment in 2025 has made it such a volatile issue?
Well, I think there are a number of factors, because immigration gets volatile when the absorptive capacity of the nation reaches what feels like its limit. This can be experienced through housing and a concern about house prices, through infrastructure, through wages. And when that falls out of sync with what people feel is a fair and balanced society, then I think anxiety about immigration rises and people blame newcomers when it's really probably policy design and planning that is to account for it. So I think often concern about migration is not necessarily rational. I think it's an emotional response. But because it's emotional, I think it's important that it's not discounted by policymakers, and that those who have those concerns aren't just shushed or even shamed because their views are deemed to be politically incorrect. My own work starts, and I'm of course a migrant to Australia myself, as you can tell from my accent. My work starts from a simple conviction that Australia's diversity is a strength when it's anchored in a confident civic core, or what I call a civic compact, one law for all, equal citizenship, institutions that keep disagreement peaceful. When that starts to fray. I think we see anxiety about immigration and we see rising concerns about multiculturalism. I should say, I think one of the factors that's prompted my own concern about multiculturalism and social cohesion in Australia has been the response of various parts of the Australian community to the invasion of Israel by Hamas on the 7th of October. And since then, we have seen, whatever one's views about the politics of the Middle East, and people do disagree, and quite rightly so, what we have seen erupting on Australian streets, it has been, I think, very disturbing, certainly for Australian Jews, but for non-Jewish Australians who care little about the politics of the Middle East, but don't want to see their society disrupted by protest that often is violent or verges on the incitement to violence. And I think when that happens, there's a concern that, you're not really fitting into Australian society, are you? And I think that's when questions about multiculturalism arise.
Do you think it is, though, something about the economic conditions in Australia that makes immigration more of a hot topic? Here at a university, we're receiving the outcome of a policy response that was designed to combat the sort of high rates of international students in universities with caps, concerns around the high levels of students coming from overseas and the impact they have on housing. A lot of what I might think of as a bit of scapegoating for international students that feeds into sort of an anti-migrant sentiment here in Victoria. And then, as you say, overlaid on that is the bringing into Australia of global conflicts and sort of playing them out in debates here in a way that isn't sort of, I think, normal for Australians to be able to, overlook difference to at least get on and that sort of John Hurst democracy of manners. We can overlook the difficult topics and get on when it comes to easier topics like, sport or food or other cultural activities.
I think you're right about the danger of scapegoating. I live in Sydney, as you said. We live very close to the University of New South Wales. And there are vast numbers of overseas students, often from Southeast Asia, who are here. And I think that it's a sort of multi-layered concern. Academics worry that their own role within the university has changed, that they are now providing a service for which the student is paying, and that therefore it's more of a contractual arrangement than an arrangement for learning.
It's an export. It's an export industry. It's not, I guess, part
Correct.
Of developing Australian human capital.
Correct. And so I think that's one aspect of the concern. But I think the influx of students into particular parts of or areas near a university, and we live in one of those areas, changes the complexion. Around here, one hears people grumbling at the bus stop about all kinds of things. Some of them are a bit, on the edge. But I think what it reflects is that people are concerned about the change that is happening to the community that they know because of a reasonably rapid influx of people from overseas, many of whom don't speak English or don't appear to speak English terribly well.
Our population growth rate is at 1.8% or roughly 500,000 a year. And almost all of that, 78% of that, is from immigration, not natural increases through births. So, the face of Australia is changing before our eyes. That's just true. But it has throughout our history, actually. So how have we dealt with this in the past? We have had periods of anti-immigration sentiments through our history. So it's something we've overcome before, but is it particularly bad now, or do you think this is a sort of regular cycle of anti-immigrant sentiment that just flows through because of, say, economic conditions?
I think every cycle feels bad and everyone thinks, it's never been like this before. And as you said in your introduction, Australia is a country that is built on immigration. And I'll use this loaded word, but the assimilation of migrants. And I think it's been very important for success as you look back over the last 100 or 200 years, particularly the last 125 years. It's been important for people to come to Australia and to assimilate, to take on its norms and its values. And as you said in your introduction, Australia changed a great deal under Robert Menzies. People like Menzies saw that there was a change from white Australia to a much more plural and multi-ethnic Australia. And not just that, but also ties to the United Kingdom changed as well. Britain's decision to enter the European, the Common Market, as it was then called, the EEC, I think was terribly disruptive to Australia's sense of its own identity. And so as a country, we have gone through successive waves of feeling that things are changing in a way that are not acceptable. What we need to do about it, and I think Menzies is a good example, is Robert Menzies himself. We need good political leadership. I don't think we can afford to have leaders who pretend that there's no problem here and that there's nothing to see, because ordinary folk in the streets going about their daily lives, commuting to work, shopping in the store, they know that things are changing. And so for them to be told by leaders that they're worrying about nothing, I think is not helpful. And we're seeing concerns. I mean, it's interesting that it's happening in Australia at the moment. We're seeing great concerns in Europe about migration and the vast movements of people across borders. And some politicians are good at identifying that as a cause for concern amongst the electorate, and they tap into it. And others just appear not to be able to come to terms with the seriousness of the issue. And I think often it's just skillful leadership. It's wise leadership. It's the capacity to discern change that is happening and to be able to reassure people that change can happen in a way that is manageable and acceptable. I think Menzies was extremely good at that. I think in the UK, Margaret Thatcher was good. And I think John Howard was as well, although he was criticised quite strongly at times. But I think Howard was able to see a change in the character of the nation. I should mention Bob Hawke. I think the Hawke government also, with the arrival of large numbers of people from Southeast Asia as refugees, that was very important. I think when people have confidence in their leaders, they're more confident about accepting the change that goes on around them.
I mean, John Howard's, I think his secret sauce was giving people confidence that he was in charge of the borders. You know, he would decide who came to this nation and the types of people who came. So you got a sense that it was under control. Something that I think, it's all very well for people to say we have too much migration, house prices are too high, our schools can't cope, our medical system can't cope. But it gets, I think, very sensitive when people say a culture is changing, and people are very sensitive around this sort of idea of Australian identity and that it is being undermined by, waves of migration that are just, too voluminous for the Australian citizenry to cope with. I mean, how do you respond to those sorts of concerns?
There are two things. The thing about house prices, it could be, I'm not an economist, it could be a canard, and one which we need to be wary of. And I should say that my colleague at the Centre for Independent Studies, Chief Economist Perter Kurti, has argued that it is absolute the housing crisis in Australia, which is real, is absolutely not a crisis of demand, it's a crisis of supply. And I mean, his argument, and economists have been critical of that, I know, but Perter argues his case with cogency and backed up with data and extensive research. Perter argues that we must not allow concerns or fears about migration to distract us from what is essentially a supply problem in the economy. So if people think, house prices are going up, I can't afford to live here, it's not because of migration, it's because of other factors. As a non-economist, I don't really feel competent to comment on that, other than to say I think this is a live debate. As to the change in the culture, I am not sure that migrants are actually the ones trying to change the culture. I think there is a question, and parts of Europe, the UK, Northern Europe, other countries in Northern Europe are really facing this. And I think we will too. I think there is an impact that comes from Muslim migration, because I think Islam is not just a religion in the way that Christianity is. It's a political system and brings with it a series of beliefs about the structures and institutions of society. And I think that can be difficult, and it has to be managed sensitively, because not every Muslim wants to see Sharia law imposed in Australia, but there are Muslims who do. And there are Muslims who want to practice their own or enshrine their own cultural practices here. And I think we've seen that with child marriage, with female genital mutilation, with things like that, or polygamy. That puts a strain on our culture. But I think that's a minority thing. But I think it attracts a lot of attention when these stories come to prominence. Where I think the culture is actually changing, it's from within Australia. And I think often it's people on what we might call, in rather casual terms, the political left, who want to undermine Australia's sense of its own identity and its legitimacy. We've seen this with the post-colonial view of the world that Australia is a settler colony, people have been displaced, genocide was practiced here, we are illegitimate, we don't belong. And I think those sorts of questions are very hot political topics. I mean, we saw that during the Voice referendum campaign. And I think that poses a greater sense of challenge to our culture than migrants. I mean, every year we have this, we know it's coming up, another round of debates about Australia Day and the legitimacy of Australia Day. But, the Bangladeshi taxi drivers who ferry me around Sydney, for example, are committed to Australia. They're committed to being here, to giving their kids a better life than they have had. Often their kids are in college, they're college graduates. And they love Australia. They love Australia Day and they love everything about it. I think often it's Australians themselves, some Australians themselves, who are actually trying to put a dent in our sense of cultural self-esteem.
Your report talks about this idea of civic nationalism, that we will have different values. I mean, we all do have different values, things that we hold dear that someone, our neighbour will not think is so important, and that reflects the complexity and diversity of the human experience. But you argue that it's this coming together around a respect and understanding of our democracy and what makes Australia's democracy tick is core to our social cohesion. And when we welcome migrants, there needs to be a level of acceptance of our civic status. How do you think we nurture that, and why do you argue that that's more important than shared values?
Because we don't have shared values. And I think what I've been concerned with is identifying what can be the basis of our national life when we don't have shared values and where values are often incommensurable. And I think that Australia clearly is a country that, unlike Japan, cannot be identified in terms, or its national identity is not about ethnic nationalism. I mean, that's just clearly not the case. One only has to walk down the street to see that. So what is it? What are, as the title of my report puts it, what are the ties that bind us? And I argue that Australia, like any democracy, needs a shared civic ground, rules that we live by without demanding sameness in the culture, so that we can disagree about values. We can argue that the values that we have about, say, family life or the raising of children or religious belief, those will differ, those will vary, and we will not have a uniform set of values. So arguing about the family, for example, we saw that Australia has changed a great deal in recent years with the same-sex marriage debate, and suddenly we're thinking in new ways about what marriage is as an institution, what the family is as an institution. So we disagree about those sorts of principles, about those sorts of values. But I think civic nationalism, I think of it as a loyalty to a common project. And that loyalty needs to be directed towards the Constitution, towards the rule of law, equal citizenship, the democratic process, and a common language that public life can run on. And I do think the teaching of English is important. I think that all migrants need to be able to be conversant in English, because I think it's the language in which the life of the nation is run. So this is not about a blood and soil identity, if I can put it in those terms. It's not about cultural uniformity. I think that restrictive nationalisms actually police ancestry, culture in ways that are unhelpful. What I think of as civic nationalism sets a framework, a public framework, which emphasizes freedom and responsibility and reciprocity, and invites people of many different cultures and from different backgrounds to belong to Australia on equal terms.
But what then makes this particularly Australian? I mean, you could be describing any number of liberal democracies. So in terms of that political community that we're part of as Australians, that I think is so important to our identity, civics isn't necessarily peculiar to us here, is it?
No, it's not. It's not. And I think there are parallels that we can draw with countries like the United Kingdom or the United States, other European countries. But I write about Australia because I'm an Australian citizen, and CIS is an Australian think tank. And my concern is with the cultural prosperity of this country. I draw on work from overseas in my own research and writing, but I'm concerned about, let's call it the civic health of this country. And I care about it because I came here 31 years ago. It's been a great place to live. I love living in Australia. I'm proud to be an Australian citizen. And when I see things coming apart, I worry about it. I'm not one of those Australians who say, well, I'll just go back to the UK because I don't want to live in the UK again.
I think having been there last week, I'd say things are a lot worse. So you're better to be here.
Well, the other reason I love living in Australia. And so when my concern, and I talk about Australia because that is where I want to direct the attention of other Australians and to say, hang on, this is something that we need to be aware of and we need to be thinking about, and we need not to be complacent about the future of the country.
I'm sure we'll get lots of questions on that issue. There's been a big debate for 30 years or so about multiculturalism. Multicultural Australia was introduced by the Whitlam government in the 70s, and the Fraser government really continued it, but it came under criticism by the Howard opposition or the coalition in opposition as it was implemented through the Hawke-Keating years. And then the Howard government really, really pushed back on it, introducing citizenship tests and trying to sort of present a robust defence of Australianness, Australian identity, rather than this sort of idea of a disaggregated identity through different cultural groups that, hodgepodge together, we all are Australian. But actually there wasn't really anything unifying us in terms of who we are. And I would say your description of this civic nationalism, again, it could mean that we were equally British or American. We're just sort of all these liberal Democrats in terms of our commitment to institutions of liberal democracy. But, I mean, what do you say to those who criticise multiculturalism as denying the existence of an Australian culture, Peter? Maybe you don't care.
It's not, my concern about multiculturalism is not that, because I think in a sense the culture of Australia is multicultural, or as one friend of mine puts it, he would say not multiculturalism, but multiculturality. That there are different cultures in this country, and I think that makes Australia a very rich country. But multiculturalism cannot extend to diversity of points of view about the validity of the rule of law, for example, the status of our courts or the state of our parliamentary democracy. I don't think those institutions, just to take some examples, can be challenged. I think multiculturalism works, and it has worked for the most part in Australia. And I know I have irritated a number of friends because they would say, no, multiculturalism, there's nothing wrong with it and it works perfectly well, but we've got to have political leaders who take a stand. And I think that's true. And I think Menzies was somebody, and Howard in their own ways, who were politicians who were able to do that. My concern now is that some of our political leaders grew up with multiculturalism, and I'm not sure are as committed to the idea of one overarching Australian sense of identity, which can accommodate different cultures. I would say multiculturalism works, and for the most part it does work in Australia when it's civic anchored. As I've said, one law for all, English in common life, but space for cultural difference. But I think it fails when it turns into rejectionism, if I might put it in those terms. It fails if it denies that there's any shared Australian culture. And it succeeds when it's anchored in civic norms and a confident mainstream. One of the things I like to do with near to the coast here, and one of the things that it's always lovely to do, particularly in the summer, is to go to the beach and you just see, people from every racial and ethnic background are on the beach, and everyone just loves the beach and they like to splash around in the water and they enjoy this, it's an overused word, but this iconic Australian landscape. And I think there's a sense in which it always gladdens my heart, because I think that shows that whatever it is that divides us in terms of values or political points of view, there is something that unites us in our shared appreciation of the freedom that we have to go about our daily lives in whatever way we want. And I think that's extremely important. And I think that is part of the shared Australian culture. It succeeds when it's anchored in civic norms and a confident mainstream. And I think that's very important. And the mainstream, the confidence of the mainstream does need to be articulated by political leaders. Leaders in the media as well and in the churches, but political leaders who have a particular influence.
Peter,
well, Howard, can I just, you mentioned Howard, and I just want to say that Howard once said, I can't remember where he said this, that successful settlement looks like biculturalism. You keep what you can, you adopt what you must. And I think that's a really pithy phrase. Keep what you can, adopt what you must. And that captures, I think, the heart of what a successful multicultural society can be and needs to be.
In our final minute before we go to audience Q&A, Peter, in your paper you give some prescriptions for sorts of policy changes that could be implemented to improve Australia's social cohesion. Can you give us a 30-second rundown on what they would be? Sorry to really give you a limited amount of time.
Yes, okay. In a nutshell, I would say what we have to do is we do have to match intake to capacity when it comes to migration. We have to invest in terms of civics education. We have to invest in integration. I think we have to defend the neutrality of institutions. So we don't want to see our courts straying into cultural battles. And we need to teach our civic story. I think civics education is very important. I think that protecting the clear rules that protect against intimidation on, for example, when I say institutions, and I mentioned the course, but let's talk about the universities. The university campuses need to be neutral places as well, where diversity can be tolerated but doesn't dominate in a way that silences. So I think civics education, matching immigration to capacity, emphasizing the importance of what unites us rather than what divides us, and ensuring that the rule of law and the enforcement of law and the enforcement of all rules is conducted on equal terms.
We are now at 3:30, so we've had our half an hour discussion, Peter, and it's the audience's turn now. But I would just say, as the host's prerogative here, it's interesting you haven't mentioned history. You didn't mention how important it was to teach Australian history and an understanding of history and the history of our democracy and how that, I believe, is incredibly important to our social cohesion, that we have that sense of unity around history. We might not have all experienced history from as far back as others, but we come here connected to this land and culture and democracy, and these institutions didn't just come out of nowhere. They came out of our history. So an understanding of that is so important. But I'm not going to give you a chance to respond because we have to go to our audience Q&A. Helen would like to know why, if we blame migration for current problems, she believes it's poor policy and planning by the current government. Why does the government do this? Is there an underlying factor like propping up inflation, securing votes, or out-and-out socialism?
Well, so thank you, Helen. That's a really good question. I'm not active in politics, so I can't really account for what politicians do. I think that it's easy to think that migration is the root of all the problems that we have, and to blame the stranger, to blame the foreigner for situations that can seem intractable. I think that planning, in terms of property planning, is an important factor to play in the way in which our economy has the capacity to absorb more migrants. I think that economic policy, energy policy, for example, which was almost certainly bound to put pressure on households and businesses as energy costs rise, is another factor. I think that, and Georgina and I have touched on this in our conversation, I think that the capacity of political leaders to remind us of what the story of Australia is and who we are and why we are. Often we'll hear politicians say, they'll respond to something and say, that's un-Australian, or, there's no place for X, Y, or Z in Australia when X, Y, or Z is actually happening. And I think that people get cynical about politics. I think they get cynical about politicians and so start to think that a response to a particular problem is driven by a need to secure votes. Georgina's been in an election campaign on more than one occasion, so she will know more about securing votes than I do. She will know more about securing votes than I do. But I think all the factors that you've mentioned, Helen, I think do have a part to play in a common response to problems of migration.
James, he's asked, I think, what really is a nice follow-up to that about Indian migration. So it obviously was in the media the other day where politicians were concerned about the use of Indian migration to secure votes. He asked, is there a particular anxiety about the recent number of Indian immigrants? Is this justified?
Well, I haven't detected any anxiety in Sydney. I think we hear people talk more about Chinese migration, but that's often just in terms of overseas students who come on a temporary basis. I don't know. And I think that I have to say, I know Senator Jacinta Price and I have high regard for her. I don't know why she got into that particular issue. I think it's unhelpful. And I think when politicians say, oh, you take your position on X because you want the votes from that part of the community, I think that's unhelpful. It has happened in the UK, of course, when Tony Blair was Prime Minister and opened the gates to a lot of migration from Eastern Europe. Now, people came from Poland. They were white. They were Christian. They were, they shared much in terms of the cultural makeup of the UK. But many people felt overwhelmed by that huge number of Polish migrants. And cynics felt, and I'm not sure this has been entirely disproven, but cynics felt that what Blair was doing was admitting so many people who will be so grateful to the Blair government that they will vote Labour in eternity. And I don't think that is helpful. There may be an element of truth in it, but it's not an area that I think is particularly fruitful to investigate.
It's not a new, you've given the example of Blair, but I can think of the example of Whitlam in the 70s saying he didn't want to let in Vietnamese refugees because they would be like the displaced people fleeing the Soviet Union in the 50s who came to Australia very grateful for a country that was not communist and thankful for the Menzies government for allowing them to come and then were loyal Menzies voters. And so, Labor during that period thought that the Menzies government was using immigration as a way to prop up support, bringing in, say, Eastern European migrants who were dyed-in-the-wool anti-communists and therefore anti-Labor, given the connections with the Communist Party of Australia and the Union movement and therefore the Labor Party back then. So, this isn't a new phenomenon to allege that your political opponents are supporting migration by a particular ethnic group in order to support their political party.
No, it's not.
Whether it's right or wrong, it's...
Well, I don't think it's... Whether it is right or wrong, I don't think it's a helpful scene to mine.
No.
In public life, because it becomes a major distraction, and politicians, as we've seen with Senator Price, can dig themselves into ever-deepening holes.
Well, it also undermines the individual within those migrant groups who might have their own particular political views, irrespective of where they've come from. So I think it's a lack of respect, personally. Stephen, another allusion to the UK here. Keir Starmer walked back from describing the UK as an island of strangers. But is there a risk of this applying here?
No, I don't think so. Starmer faces a particular problem which has got a number of components. One is this migration across the Channel and the arrivals of vast numbers of people that seems to be unstoppable. Now, this was a big issue in Australia under the Rudd and Gillard governments. Tony Abbott came to office pledging to stop the boats. People responded well to that. Georgina's referred to John Howard's election campaign statement about deciding who comes to Australia. I think one of the problems that Starmer faces is that there is this intractable problem with migration, and neither Starmer nor Rishi Sunak and leaders before them were able to do much about it. It's a big problem, I think, that is posing a great threat to British society. The other thing is that I think Islam has had a bigger negative impact in the UK than it has had here. And it's through scandals like the Rotherham child sex abuse scandal and other things that come to light when we find that Muslim men have been involved in trafficking children. And I think this just enrages people and makes people feel quite hostile to Muslims in general, which I think is very unfortunate, but it's sort of one of the things that happens.
That sort of sense that if you're from a certain ethnic minority, you can get away with it, but if you were from, say, the majority, in Britain's case, let's say the white Anglo-Saxon majority, that you wouldn't get away with it. Is that
Correct.
there's some sort of excuse for people
and the
from
police
different
said
cultures?
that they didn't prosecute or didn't investigate because they didn't want to be accused of being Islamophobic. And of course, the British police forces, the Metropolitan Police Force in particular, has had a terrible history of racism. So, it's a very difficult problem, I think. And I think it's different from here. I don't think we are becoming a nation of strangers. I think we could become a nation of strangers if we don't attend to the health of our civic life. And that's one of the things that motivates me in my work. In a sense, I think, we don't want to go there. We want to preserve what we have and strengthen what we have. So I don't think we are a nation of strangers. And I don't think we're certainly not seeing the volatility around the arrival of refugees that we're seeing in Britain at the moment. We don't have a Nigel Farage character, and Farage and the Reform Party, they are symptoms of a deeper problem. Farage is not creating this problem. Reform is not creating this problem. We don't have those issues here.
Although I would just say in small rebuttal to that and reflecting on when we haven't commented on this, you note that we need to be a society that can peacefully negotiate our differences. I mean, I would say the recent increase in support for One Nation, which does have strong, Nigel Farage-esque anti-immigrant views, that might reflect that people are starting to shift support to parties like Reform UK.
Yes, I think also that's just the general disillusion with the Liberal Party, the state of the Liberal Party. I think people are drifting away from the Liberal Party for all kinds of problems that the party itself has. Yes, it's true that One Nation, and I suppose to an extent Clive Palmer as well in his political career has articulated some of those concerns. The big difference, of course, is that Pauline Hanson is unlikely ever to be Prime Minister. I don't think it's out of the realms of possibility that Nigel Farage will be Prime Minister.
Yeah, certainly looks that way, although the election is 4 years away. So
That is
a very long time in politics.
But the Tories are in big trouble.
They certainly are. It was interesting last week when I was there and they had the Labor Party conference. Keir Starmer didn't talk about Kemi Badenoch and the Conservative Party. He only talked about Nigel Farage and Reform UK. It was as if the Conservative Party was just a non-entity. They don't matter anymore, which I thought was very telling. Sally Layson runs the Rule of Law Institute in Sydney. She has a comment, not a question, but it's a good comment, so it deserves to be read. Well done, Peter, for providing a positive and cohesive way to reflect on our civic identity. What is so fantastic about this approach is that it focuses on those ideals that protect our rights and freedoms in a forward-looking way, rather than getting caught up in a contentious historical colonialisation quagmire. So Sally and I would disagree on the importance of teaching history for a sense of national unity and identity, but a nice comment.
Can I make two observations?
You can.
Say hi to Sally, and Sally's also a great friend of the Centre for Independent Studies. In fact, we are also neighbours because the Rule of Law Institute is based in the same building that we're located in. So it's nice, Sally, great to have you join us. Yeah. Let me just come back to this point of history, because you're right. I didn't use the word history, but I did talk about our civic story, and I really am using that phrase to embrace history. I think history is a sense of who we are as a nation is intimately bound up with our history and our understanding of history, and which is why I think history needs to be taught. In a sense, all teaching is a bit ideological, but we need to teach more than just Indigenous history. We need to teach the constitutional history of our country and the founding of the country, and the founding of a country by, for the most part, men who were creatures of the Enlightenment and brought with them Enlightenment principles. David Kemp is a scholar who's done some tremendous work in this area. And I think, so I agree with you. I didn't use the word history, but I just did want to make that point because I'm not indifferent to history.
Well, that is very good to hear. I didn't think you were, by the way. A question here from Stuart Gill. Has Australia been more of a mosaic or a melting pot? Oh, I like this question.
Question. Thank you, Stuart. I'm going to plumb for mosaic because I think melting pot is a term that's used more of the United States. And I think we are different. We are very different from the United States in so many ways. I think that we have been better. We're probably a bit of both, probably a bit of melting and mosaic. But I think we have been better at allowing people to retain, going back to John Howard's comment, to retain what they can. I think we've been better at allowing people to retain what they can, but we need to be better at emphasizing what they must embrace. And I think the Americans have always been really clear about migrants to the United States. They become Americans. They pledge allegiance to the flag. The Pledge of Allegiance is said daily in schools, or at least it was when my wife was in school. And I think that this idea that you come and, in a sense, those boundaries that distinguished you melt away in your new country are more pronounced in the United States. But at the same time, I mean, I think people have maintained very clear and distinctive ethnic identities, or things of, Polish Americans or Lithuanian Americans or Irish Americans. So probably a bit of both, but I rather like the idea of mosaics, because I think mosaics are rather more elegant than things that melt in a pot.
Well, my husband is in his 40s and he spent a little of his childhood in the United States in the early 90s, and they were still doing the Pledge of Allegiance back then. So I can't speak for the next 30 years, but I always thought it was quite a lovely tradition because it does instill that sense of patriotism.
And pride.
And, real pride in the Constitution and the nation that you're living in. So building on this point, Cliff asks about values, which, I think is a really central question in this debate we're having here, discussion we're having here is, so why do we allow migrants into Australia who don't like Western values and Judeo-Christian values in particular? I mean, that is a genuine question. I think it's a difficult question. I think in our public debate we're not having those discussions because it seems a bit too difficult. But it's, some people are very concerned that values, our values are quintessentially Australian. They're informed by our Judeo-Christian heritage, and that welcoming people into Australia who do not share those values, whether they're believers or not, I think is irrelevant, but share those values could be injurious to our culture, to our country.
I think that's correct. I don't think we can say that Australia is now a Judeo-Christian country, but I think that you're right to say that it derives the principles that undergird its institutions from the Judeo-Christian tradition, our understanding of law, of rights, of the value of human identity, of liberty. I think those are things that are derived from that tradition. But I think that when I speak about value pluralism, as I do in this report, I'm not embracing value relativism or cultural relativism. I'm just recognizing that value pluralism says that real goods in our sense of what the good life is about will often conflict, and that we can't expect people to come to an agreement on those things. You ask why you'd come to Australia if you don't like Australia. I really don't know. Why would you come to a country if you didn't like its values? I mean, I don't particularly want to go and live in Iran or go and work in Tehran. So I don't have an answer to that question, although I think it's an important question. But I do think that we can accept value pluralism. We can accept that people will have differing conceptions and perhaps even conflicting conceptions of what the good life is. But unity comes from institutions that let us live with those conflicts without becoming enemies, without turning into enemies. And one of the things that's really concerned me in the last 2 years is that I feel that one section of the Australian community, or a number of sections of the Australian community, have turned Australian Jews into enemies. And that, I think, is totally unacceptable, because that really is going to tear us apart. So I think it's just value pluralism is recognizing that human goods are many and sometimes in tension. But while we can't enforce a moral consensus, we can build institutions that manage disagreement fairly. Free speech is very important, the due process of law, impartial administration, open and free elections. We need to defend those institutions and ensure that those institutions will defend us, because our status as citizens is important. So it's about managing difference rather than trying to resolve difference, which often I think can't be done.
I think the question of whether we need a moral consensus or not is a really, really interesting one. I sort of was reflecting as you were speaking on the idea of mateship, which people say is a part of Australian identity. And I mean, you're actually an ordained Anglican priest. I should have mentioned that. So you live and breathe Judeo-Christian values. But the idea of mateship to me speaks to the Christian message of love thy neighbour as thyself, that we care about each other and our community. But there are people who don't really, they're completely individualistic and don't don't really care. And they're still Australian, and that is kind of the varying colours of who we are as human beings all living here on this land. A question that is, I guess, again, related from Gary. He asks, is there a need to curb migration from certain countries? Which I think is a really interesting one. I mean, it sort of presupposes that if you're from a country, you agree with everyone else in your country about, the government or the way of life. I mean, you might be leaving that country because you hate it and you want to come to Australia because you like it. But anyway, your views, Peter.
Well, I think the simple answer to that is yes. We saw concern that was raised in the community when the Albanese government admitted large numbers of refugees from Gaza. And I think we need to be very careful about admitting to Australia people who come from Gaza, who may well have been, although I'm not saying that they were, but it's not unreasonable to think that they may have been sympathetic to the cause of Hamas, which has ruled Gaza ruthlessly for a long time now. I think the assailant at the Manchester synagogue attack at the weekend was a Syrian refugee. I think we have to be very careful about bringing people from countries that have been defined in some ways by one form or another of Islamist terror. And I just don't think we can afford to have people like that in this country. And I think there needs to be effective screening. And the problem is, it's not just, I'm not saying that just because of my own concern, because I think it will change irreparably the quality of life in this country. I think it's also poses a threat to Australian Muslims who either were born here or migrated here in search of a better life, in search of that thing, that quality of life that Georgina has talked about, and who then risk becoming tarred with that same brush. I think that's a terrible thing to happen, and we need to be really careful to ensure that that doesn't happen. But I think, on the whole, migrants from Hungary are probably going to be okay. I know a lot of Hungarians who have made Australia home and came with deep gratitude and have embraced everything this country has to offer and have made a very distinguished contribution. So I'm sort of thinking as we go here, but yes, I think the answer in a simple way is yes, we do have to be careful where people come from. But what we need to be more concerned is what sort of people are coming here. And we don't want Hungarian fascists coming here, although I think a few of them did. We don't want people who bring with them ideologies that are deeply not just antagonistic to, but destructive, have the potential to be destructive of our way of life. At the moment, I think the principal threat to the sort of society that we have in Australia comes not from fascism, but from Islamism. And we have to be very careful about that.
I guess, and we've got so many questions coming in, so I'm not going to rave on too much, and we've only got 5 minutes to go. But I guess you've got then the question of say you're in Syria, you're Muslim, but you're being, persecuted and fearing for your life, and you flee and seek to become a refugee in Australia. I mean, what do you say to those people? Yes, some go bad, and that is shocking, and we would not want that to happen. We want our security services to be preventing that. But at the same time, what's the whole basis of the refugee system if we say, no, that's a horrible country, we don't want anyone from that country, tough if you hate it there and you're being persecuted and at risk of death, just don't come in. But anyway, someone has mentioned Roger Scruton. I have to read this because, he's such a fan. What are the shared values in which we must all believe in? And I know you do have some. Roger Scruton said that neighbourliness is a key British value and should be a good value for any liberal country. Would that be true of Australian values?
Sorry, what was the value?
Neighbourliness.
Oh, neighbourliness. Yes, I think that's embraced in the idea of mateship, concern for the well-being of those amongst whom we live and work. Yes, I think neighbourliness is important. One of the things I remember concerned me when we moved to Australia in 1994 and we moved to Perth, and we were in the eastern suburbs of Perth, which are not very different from the eastern suburbs of Sydney, I can tell you. And everyone lived in the compounds with these high fibro fences, and you really couldn't see into the neighbour's garden, which I think was nice in some respects. But I came from a country where you could actually see through the wire fence into the neighbour's garden, and you could sort of chat across the fence and you knew who your neighbours were. And I remember thinking, gosh, we can all just live in this compound. We could drop down dead and lie here undiscovered for weeks and no one would know because we don't know who our neighbours are. So I think knowing your neighbour is actually very important wherever you live, particularly in the anonymous life that many of us now seem to live in cities, where we live in apartment buildings, or we live with those high fences. So I think neighbourliness is important. Scruton, I think, was often reviled as a reactionary, but I don't think he was a reactionary. He was certainly a conservative, but I don't think he was a conservative reactionary. I think he was somebody who wanted to conserve what was precious and what was important, but recognized that in order to do that, we might need to change and adapt. I'm a great admirer of Roger Scruton. Unfortunately, I never met him, but I'm a great admirer of Scruton's work.
Yeah, died way too young. A question from Rose Ganchi. Do you think our leaders are too far removed from the grassroots to really understand what everyday Islamic people's intentions are for the future of Australia and the world?
It's a very difficult question to answer. I think that any good constituency MP will know the people in his or her electorate. I think that's true of Tony Burke. He will know the people in his electorate. He'll know how it works. I think that's true of Anthony Albanese at Grainler. I remember going when Benjamin Netanyahu came to Australia as Prime Minister, and Malcolm Turnbull was both Prime Minister and member for Wentworth at the time, and going to an event where Turnbull was there and being struck by clearly how well Turnbull knew his people, as it were. He knew his electorate and knew the people of his electorate. I think it's very important. Whether there are some who are more detached than others, I'm sure there are. I think we've seen the rise of independent MPs who I think are particularly well connected because they don't owe party allegiance. Di Lee at Cabramatta, I can't remember the name of the seat, it may be Cabramatta. But
Fowler.
Di Lee,
Fowler.
Thank you. Dilene Fowler is somebody I think who is really closely connected. I think Allegra Spender in Wentworth is really connected to the community and knows people well. I think some are detached and I think are indifferent, but those are not the ones that tend to endure for long in politics, I think.
Peter, time is upon us, sadly. Thank you so much for coming on Afternoon Light Live. It's been a really important, valuable discussion. You've provoked me. I know you've been of great interest to our audience by the looks of all their reactions and questions. So a huge thanks for your time and for delivering this paper.
Thank you, Georgina. It's been a great pleasure.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.